everyone to this presentation today. As Bob mentioned, I'm David Cooper, the lead developer and architect at BlueFinity, and today what I'd like to do is go over at a fairly high level an explanation of what our new product Evoke is all about, how it's made up, and at the end take you through a fairly short and whirlwind tour of the features of the product. So this is very much an introduction to Evoke, and in fact we have other webinars that drill into the technical detail in more depth. Okay, so specifically what I'd like to do today is introduce you to the key concepts of the product, explain the purpose of Evoke, and explain at a reasonably high level how it goes about providing that functionality. And then at the end I'll probably spend 10 or 15 minutes taking you through the key parts of the product just to allow you to get a feel for what the product's like in use. So really what we are trying to do with Evoke is provide you with the ability to create really good line of business applications. And let's face it, the application development landscape out there is complex, and it's getting even more complex as we go through the years. What we set out to provide with Evoke when we sat down over a couple of years ago and started designing the product was to really tackle what we saw as 4 or 5 crucial issues in terms of application development. So top of that list was to provide tooling that makes the creation of line of business applications that are able to run across a whole range of different platforms in a much easier way. And what we're meaning there is having to learn fewer software development kits and fewer languages in terms of development languages. Also, to couple very closely with that ease of use is speeding up the whole process of building apps and deploying apps. And the main reason we provide this speed aspect is by providing automatically most of the plumbing and infrastructure that you absolutely need to have when you're building apps. Clearly nowadays we're not just talking about a green screen application, we're not even just talking about a green screen application and a Windows desktop version of that application. We're talking about a whole range of different devices and runtime environments, and this range of platforms is growing, it's not shrinking. And so one really important aspect nowadays when you're developing applications is to make sure that you're catering for all the different deployment platforms that your end users are going to expect your application to run on. Compatibility, we're talking about a couple of things here. We're talking about, firstly, the use of development tools that are compatible with other development tools and libraries and components out there in the marketplace. So what we didn't want to do was come up with a great kind of set of tools that's completely self-enclosed and you're restricted in terms of the features of the development tooling to what we provide you with. What we wanted to do was provide a great set of tools, but also to reach out and augment and add to the tooling that we're providing with all the range of thousands and hundreds of thousands of different libraries and components that are available out there in the marketplace. Compatibility also touches upon the topic of, well, if you're undertaking a sizable development task, then it may be that you'd like to supplement your current development resources with developers out there in the marketplace. And so what's really important also is to provide tooling that can be supplemented with developers that are readily available out there in the open marketplace. And lastly, but by no means least, maintainability. And again, we're talking about a couple of things here. We're talking about introducing a set of tools that encourages you to create software in a way that's well structured, well defined, is broken down into logical sections and components. And that not only helps the developers who are actively working on the project, it also helps a situation where you have developers maybe leave the project and you engage new developers to take over those ones that have left. And so at that point it becomes even more important to have a good structure within your software development projects. Secondly, in terms of maintainability, we're talking about, again, providing tooling that encourages you to create reusable components. And I'm sure I don't need to preach the benefits of that. But what we're talking about there is the ability to create components and use that, for instance, on more than one runtime platform. And it obviously just saves time, and you can focus your effort on debugging a component and know that you can reuse it, and it's just ready to go at that point. Right, so what kind of apps are we talking about here in terms of being able to create with Evoke? There are three main kinds of apps that we can identify. The first one, the browser app, it's sometimes called a web app, sometimes called an HTML5 app. And what we have here is essentially a website. Okay, it's built using web technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But it's not a normal website in the sense that what happens with a browser app is that it kind of takes on some of the UI characteristics of the platform on which it's running. And in that respect, it looks much more like a traditional application than it does a, let's say, a consumer-facing website. But essentially, it's still a website being delivered and deployed in the normal website manner. The second kind of app is termed a hybrid app. This kind of app is, again, written using web technologies, but instead of running inside the standard browser on your device, it runs inside a component called a web view. And this web view component, there's a version of a web view component provided on just about every single device platform out there. And hybrid apps are relevant for the mobile world. Okay, we're talking about tablets and phones here. And the idea is that you still write your application using HTML5 technologies, but ultimately that series of web assets, if you like, gets crunched up and runs inside this web view component. And the web view component itself is hosted within a proper native app. So what you have ultimately is a native app that runs and has access to nearly all of the hardware and software features of that device, just like a native application has. But it's still written using web technologies, and you don't have to learn a whole new several sets of SDKs in order to write native apps. The most popular wrapper that wraps around the web view is called PhoneGap, and we'll talk about PhoneGap a little bit more later on in the presentation. I mentioned it already. The third kind of app is obviously the native app. You know, good old apps written using Xcode on Apple, or you know, Eclipse using Java for Android. But of course, your traditional Windows desktop application written using WPF is also a version of a native app. And so what Evoke allows you to do is to create any kind of these apps, and the one you go for will depend on various different importance points for you, and we'll talk about those as we go through the presentation. So here's a kind of a visual representation in a bit more whizzy way of what we're talking about in terms of being able to cater for lots of different platforms and devices using Evoke. And bullet point at the bottom, others, well, yeah, it's not over yet, I'm sure, in terms of the range of platforms. Okay, so you're probably aware of the fact that there's no shortage of app development tools out there on the marketplace. So what is it that makes Evoke different? Well, we believe it's both in the approach that we take in providing app development features, and also in the breadth of platform coverage that we cater for using that tooling. So really we're talking about three main things here. We're talking about simplicity of developing applications, fewer development kits to learn, fewer development languages to learn, fewer tools to master, and easier maintenance of the app on an ongoing basis. Unification, here we're talking about being able to drive your application development activities from what is essentially a single design of your application. Unification also in the sense of being able to focus your development activities within a single integrated development environment, and we're talking about Visual Studio when we talk about IDEs here. And also unification touches upon something that I'll mention a bit later on, which is a single API internally. When you create apps with Evoke, it doesn't matter which platform they're running on, they're all centered around a single exposed app API. And lastly, acceleration, speeding up this process of getting apps out of the door. And there we're talking about having to write far less code, and the code that you do write is far less complex than you would have to write if you were using native SDKs and what have you. And also acceleration by encouraging the creation of reusable components. And on the subject of components, let's have a closer look at the main components that make up Evoke. So first of all, we start off with the app designer. And this component allows you to do three main things. The first thing it allows you to do is to define a data model for your UI, sometimes called the view model. It allows you to design the menu of your application and also the bulk of the UI, the pages that make up the actual app UI itself. Secondly, we have the app generator. And the app generator accesses the data that's been created using the app designer, and it uses it as the basis for producing Visual Studio projects. And it's within these generated Visual Studio projects that the third main component of Evoke, our runtime libraries, reside. So we've created a range of different runtime libraries for a range of different environments that support the generated code. The last thing that this slide talks about is PhoneGap, which we've mentioned. This is what you utilize for creating hybrid applications. And what the generator can do is to reach inside your Visual Studio content and extract the bits that are required to be crunched up and used in the creation of a PhoneGap application. And that just really speeds up this whole process of taking something that you've developed using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and ultimately running that as a native app on your Apple and Android devices. So what we'll see in play here is a simple yet very powerful development cycle. So you'll use the app designer to do a bit of design work. You'll then use the app generator to generate your Visual Studio projects. You can then go into Visual Studio and you can augment, enhance, embellish the generated code as much or as little as you need to, using whatever third-party components you'd like to use. Use all of Visual Studio's unit testing and other great features, and then go back, do a bit more design work, a bit more generation. The way that you customize code within Visual Studio is done in such a way that the regeneration of code does not affect the customization that you've performed within Visual Studio. And you just go round and round this loop as much as you need to. So drilling into the app designer in a little bit more detail, it's a product that runs inside the desktop browser. Obviously, being a browser-based application, you've got to browse to somewhere first of all, and what you browse to is a website that's hosted within Microsoft Azure. So BlueFinity's got a Microsoft Azure hosted environment that runs the designer application and also hosts the back-end database that's used to store the design data that you create using the designer. Bit of a side note here, the app designer is very largely written using the app designer itself, so we're kind of eating our own dog food there in terms of using the tooling that we're providing ourselves. And what we've tried to steer is a middle road, providing tooling that's quick and easy to use and intuitive, yet doesn't really hold back on the power and flexibility of the applications that you can create using it. The generator is a different beast. It's a traditional rich client Windows WPF application that you install and run on one or more of your developer PCs. And one of the main purposes of the generator is to create Visual Studio projects based on the design data that you create with the designer. What the app generator can also do, as I've mentioned, is to automatically create the what is essentially a zip file that you have to use as the basis of your PhoneGap app generation process. That just really speeds that PhoneGap application development up really tremendously. One way you can view Evoke is, in fact, as a way to supercharge your Visual Studio development. As I mentioned, it's the app generator that creates this Visual Studio content, and the projects and the structure of the stuff that the generator creates is based on standard Visual Studio templates. So anyone who knows Visual Studio will immediately be completely at home with the content that the generator produces. And in fact, what the generator produces is a complete end-to-end working solution. So it's a great way to develop apps. It's also a great way to learn how to develop apps as well. Because it's a great vehicle for having something that runs and works, and then you can start adding bits and tweaking, enhancing, and just kind of start your app creation process with 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever percentage of the work already done and in place. And you can really focus on the special bits of your apps and not the infrastructure and plumbing. A really important thing about the way that the app generator works and the code that it produces is that it's being designed to, we expect people to add customization to the Visual Studio content. And so the way in which the app generator works is with that very important aspect right at the very top of the priority list. So you can go in and add third-party components, controls, whatever, and know that when you come to run the app generator again, that customized content will be preserved and won't be trashed. And just a final footnote there, Evoke works just fine with Express versions of Visual Studio. The third component that I mentioned in that slide a while back, the runtime libraries, we provide a runtime library suite for each of our supported environments that's optimized and targeted and squeezes the best possible user experience out of the range of platforms that Evoke supports and will support in the future. Something I did mention a little while ago, these runtime libraries, doesn't matter what language or platform they're running on, they all project and expose a common API for you to work with in terms of custom code, in terms of the content of your application. So sometimes you may have to develop your application using HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Sometimes, because of the nature of the device platform, you may develop in C# and XAML. Well, even though you're working in separate programming languages, the API that you're working against is consistent across those different environments, which is really, really important. For many of the runtime libraries, the source code is available, so you can see how we're doing stuff. You can step into it when you're debugging, what have you. And these runtime libraries, obviously owned by BlueFinity, we maintain them. They're a vital component to Evoke, and so they're being continually enhanced by us. I'll talk a little bit more about customized code now, because I think it was in one of the first slides where we said that what we wanted to provide was a set of tooling that kind of steered a line between being really easy to use yet didn't hold back on the power and flexibility of what you could ultimately do with an application. And the main vehicle that's in there supporting those last couple of points, the power and flexibility, is the fact that you can, within Visual Studio, reach out and utilize pretty much any Visual Studio compatible component on the marketplace. And that means that you can be really comfortable in the knowledge that it doesn't really matter what you need to do inside your application, you're going to be able to do it inside Visual Studio. Visual Studio is arguably the best IDE on the market, and by working very closely with Visual Studio, we're able to make sure that you can add whatever custom content you need to produce the best possible user experience inside your app. Database connectivity is, of course, really important because we're talking about line of business applications here. Evoke at the moment is focused on MultiValue database connectivity at the back end, and as such we've got support for the native Rocket data client connection pooling technology, and of course, being BlueFinity, we've also got support for connections to your back-end MultiValue database, which can be pretty much any of the major ones using the BlueFinity MV.NET product. But we will be extending Evoke to completely embrace SQL databases, and in fact non-SQL databases as well. And the architecture of Evoke is such that there's nothing to stop you writing your own custom database connectivity for the back end if you so desire. A little bit more about PhoneGap. PhoneGap is a really great product, and the integration that we provide within the app generator means that you can focus pretty much 99.5% of your development effort inside Visual Studio, testing it inside the browser, maybe connecting up a device and browsing to the website using that device to get the final end user experience. And when you've debugged it and everything's working fine, you literally need to fill in 2 or 3 input fields inside the generator, click a button, and the app generator goes to your Visual Studio project, extracts all the various assets it needs, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, does some pre-processing that it knows it's got to do, and creates a zip file. If you subscribe to the Adobe PhoneGap build service, which costs an astronomical $10 a month, all you need to do at that point is browse to your Cloud Build portal, upload this zip file, and out pops, within about 5 or 10 seconds, the APK or other package file that you need to deploy onto the physical mobile device, and that's either through sideloading or through submission to the appropriate app store. So it just makes the process of building a PhoneGap application really, really simple and very, very cost efficient. Okay, so there's lots in Evoke already, as you'll see when we start using it. And in fact, there's a load more coming this year. So let's just take a little look at the 2004 roadmap. So as we stand right now, we've got support for the desktop browser and for the iPad device. In literally 2 or 3 weeks' time, we'll be adding iPhone and Android tablet and Android phone support to Evoke. And as we move further into this year, we'll be adding support for the Windows side of things. That's Windows 8, Windows Phone, WPF, very important for us. Lots of people out there still using Windows 7, don't want to go near Windows 8, so if they want to have traditional desktop applications, WPF is the way to go still. And then Xamarin, some of you may know Xamarin. Xamarin's a really excellent piece of technology, and it allows you to essentially write native applications for Apple and Android using C#. So we'll be adding support for the Xamarin environment within Evoke during the year as well. Lots of core functionality is going to be added to the product. And top of the list there, support for offline storage of your application data, and also the ability to resync that potentially updated version of your application data when the app regains network connectivity. And as I mentioned, we're adding support for additional database platforms, SQL obviously being the top of the list there. We'll use the app designer in a moment, and we've got lots of stuff going into the app designer this year. DTP is an acronym for Design Time Programming. We used to call it 4GL functionality 15 years ago, but we've moved on a bit since then. It's just the ability to provide and create app functionality without having to write program code. Internationalization's really important. Adding an internal security model to your apps, again, really important. And we're going to be adding a checkout check-in system to the designer to improve the multi-developer experience inside the designer product. The app generator is also going to share the love here, and we're going to be adding all sorts of things to the generator, adding extra menu styles and color themes, but also being able to, when you generate your Visual Studio projects, to be able to say, well, you know, what I'd like to do is use, let's say, the Developer Express or the Telerik component libraries automatically within the generator code, as opposed to using the stock out-of-the-box components that come with Evoke. And that just makes the integration of and use of your favorite third-party libraries easier. This slide, there's a little bit of trumpet blowing on behalf of the people inside BlueFinity. Clearly, in developing Evoke, we've had to put in place a whole range of development expertise. And so I guess really what I'm trying to put over in the next couple of slides is to encourage you to not just view BlueFinity as a pure product supplier, but also view us as an app development partner that can make available to you all sorts of industry technology advice and experiences in order to help you along that what can be a fairly choppy app development road path. So everyone who works inside BlueFinity has got business skills. You know, we're not just techies. We've been out there. We've done it in the real world. And so we're able to provide really great insights as to our experiences and the best way to go about developing apps to achieve certain end goals or objectives. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing inside BlueFinity is tracking the technologies out there. You know, obviously very important that BlueFinity is completely up to speed with what's happening, and we do that really to save you having to do so much of it, so that you can focus on your development activities and not have to worry about what's the next latest and greatest craze coming out there, because that's what we're doing. Right, so just to summarize what I've covered in the presentation, we really think Evoke is an innovative new approach to going about and rising to the challenge of creating apps that are able to run on all the important platforms out there. And when we talk about best of both worlds, we're talking about the ability to use tooling that speeds up and just makes a whole lot easier this process of creating apps, but which doesn't stop you incorporating any other components that you can get hold of out in the market there. We are completely focused on line of business. Everything that we do is driven by the needs of the line of business developer, and of course line of business is the real core strength of MultiValue. And so all of the industry watching, all of that, all of those activities are all focused around this end goal of producing line of business apps. And as you've seen, we've got a pretty aggressive functionality rollout plan for this year, and no doubt there will be more next year, and that's fine. You know, we're all in with Evoke here. We're completely committed to this product. We think it's a brilliant idea, and the reaction that we're having from the market so far, and it's only been out a few weeks, has been absolutely phenomenal. You know, we're very flattered by the attention and interest that we're receiving with Evoke. Right, so a quick product tour. This will only be, you know, maybe 10, 12 minutes, because the idea of this presentation is really to give you a backdrop for Evoke. But it's nice just to see a few bits of it in action. So we'll use the app designer just very quickly. We'll then use the app generator to create a Visual Studio project, and we'll fire that project up, have a look at it running, and then if we've got time to have a very, very quick look at the Visual Studio solution that the generator has produced. So let me just hop out of this PowerPoint for a second, and let me pull up Internet Explorer. So this is the URL that we're going to browse to. So this is the Azure hosted website and infrastructure that the Evoke designer runs on. Just taking a while to load up over this GoToMeeting session. So when you subscribe to Evoke, and there, I've said it now, we do operate a subscription-based pricing for the product. Speak to Bob or David for more details on that. You'll get some login credentials. When you log in, you get to a front page that allows you to select an app that you've already been working on or create a new one. I'm going to select one of the example applications. That loads it up. So what's happening here is the design of the application is being loaded into browser memory. And
okay, yeah. I just called the phone number that was on the contact us. So.
That's very interesting. I seem to have got crosstalk there.
Brenda at Folk.
Muted. Unmuted. Muted. Unmuted.
Is David still here? Everyone hold on for 1 minute, please.
Can you hear me now, Bob?
We hear you. Yes, David.
I do apologise. In my haste to cut out background noise, I muted myself. Well, that's a bit of a schoolboy error. There we are. So, where was I? Yes, I was saying that what the browser's done here is to load the app design into memory, and it's made available the data menu and pages tab, where you'll do the majority of your work in terms of app design. So the data tab is where you can build up your data model. Now the purpose of this data model or entity model, view model, whatever you want to call it, is to feed data to the UI. And so what you should focus on when you're creating this data model is, what does my UI need? What's the best way of providing data to my UI? And obviously your data model will develop and will build up in unison with the design of your UI as well. You know, it's very much an integrated process here. So you shouldn't really be focused on what's the data like in my back-end database at this point? Obviously these two worlds have got to join at some point, and we'll look at where those two worlds join later. But what you're focused on here is putting together the best possible data structures to feed your UI. The menu page allows you to create the logical menu structure for your app. And the menu designer also introduces the concept of what we call design time platforms. And these are listed over here on the left. So the design time platforms, desktop, tablet, phone and modern UI, are what we have broken down all of the different runtime environments and devices into in terms of design activity. When the app generator comes to do its work, you'll then at that point say, do you know what, inside Visual Studio I'd like to generate projects that support deployment onto iPhone, iPad, Android tablet, WPF, whatever. And at that point the app generator looks for the design that is most appropriate for that particular kind of platform. And what happens here is a kind of a fallback process. So let's say, for example, that you say I want to support my application running on an iPhone. The generator will look for a menu design specifically for the phone platform. If it can't find one, it'll look for a design based on the tablet platform. And if it's there, it will use it. If there's not a tablet one, the ultimate kind of baseline design here is the desktop, and it'll use the desktop one. So this allows you to utilize or split and branch your development or design activity as you need to based on the specifics of your app. The page designer is probably where you'll spend the majority of your time inside the designer, because this is where the bulk of the UI is created. And we've got the concept here of what we call a page series. The page series is simply a term used to describe the feature whereby you can have one or more pages all logically associated with a menu option. Perhaps the best way to explain that is to have a look at one. If I click on this customers page series here, we can see that we've only got a design for the desktop runtime environment. Exactly the same process applies for your pages as it does for the menu, in the sense that when the app generator is doing its work, it'll look for the design that closest matches the particular runtime environment or device that you're generating Visual Studio content for. So here we've only created one design for our customers page series, and that's for the desktop environment. So in fact that'll be used for all the different environments. If we hop into this tab, we can see this page running. So here we've got a situation where we can type in to that top box a bit of a customer name. If I go and type in a new one, say fence, there we are. We can see that we've got a central section there that's displaying the selected names, and then as we go and choose a row, the details change down at the bottom. What we've also got is the ability to click the order history button in the bottom left, and that in this case doesn't, because I've probably broken this. That should take us into that's embarrassing, that should take us into a second screen, well, which is this one. Let me show you this one here. I'll show you inside the designer. That's what the second screen looks like. And of course it's a list of the orders for the selected customer. In fact, this is singular multi-valued and sub-valued data down on the physical database. So the idea is that you're able to string together a number of different pages within your page series and create navigation points for the end user so that they can drill into, move sideways, that kind of navigation scheme within the series itself. And yeah, we can see a paid series in action within the designer itself here, because this actual design part of the designer is part of a paid series, because the designer has been written using the designer. Having created some or all of your app design, you then need to fire up the app generator. So let's do that. So as I mentioned, the app generator is a WPF local Windows executable that's been installed using a setup.exe process. But the credentials that we're using here to log into are the same as those that we use for the designer. If I just bring my screen over here, and we're going to choose the app that we've just been looking at within the app designer. So the generator is now retrieving all the metadata about that app, and we're just going to run with the defaults here. We're going to launch Visual Studio, and if I just pull up, there we are. So that's the empty directory that we're going to generate content into. I've chosen the platforms I'm interested in and other various settings. Hit the generator, goes away, and it generates an awful lot of stuff here for you. It's not just generating UI, it's generating all of the infrastructure, website, web service, a RESTful web service, and all the back-end database connectivity as well. And there we can see the content that's been produced by the generator. If I just pull up the File Explorer, you can see that there we have it. And if we build that, I'll bring over the browser. So you can see that fire up. It runs a bit slowly on the GoToMeeting session. It's automatically incorporated a login page for you, which we'll just fill in. And there we can see the page that's been generated. And this time, the order history button does work. Hurrah. So you can see that what the generator has produced is a working application. It almost definitely will not be the final version that you run with. You will need to go into Visual Studio. You are able to go into Visual Studio. We kind of expect you to go into Visual Studio and add stuff that's application specific to the content that the generator has produced. But what the generator has done is to create a huge percentage of the overall application development work for you. One kind of footnote, all of the database connectivity that has been generated within that Visual Studio solution has been based upon information that has been created with the generator. So this is where the world of the data model that you've created within the designer meets the data world as it exists down in your database server. So these are where these two worlds are mapped together, and this is what the generator has used in order to get at data to populate the UI that it's also generated. Okay, Bob, I think that's most of the content that I wanted to cover today.
Good, David. We did have a couple of questions.
We have, yes.
We
indeed.
did, yes. One of the questions is, will the PowerPoint presentation be available? And the answer is yes. For those in the UK, please contact David Peters, or David will be contacting you. And in the US, of course, I will be following up on everyone. There was another question, will Visual Basic be made available?
The answer to that is yes. As you can see inside the generator screen, we've got the Visual Basic button grayed out at the moment, but that will be added as part of the roadmap of this year. It's an essential, important feature for us to add. So the answer to that is yes. We have got a number of questions coming in now. I'm just kind of flicking through them. We've got one that talks about the locking model, the record locking model that's used by Evoke. Good point. The record locking that Evoke operates is based on an optimistic record locking paradigm. And the way that works is that when Evoke reads data initially from the database, it automatically computes an update hash based on the data that's been retrieved. And when an update comes back, it makes sure that that update hash matches the current content on the database, and the update will only be allowed to go through if those computed hashes match. Ultimately, we do perform read-use down on the database server just before updates do go through. So this optimistic locking model is completely compatible with the traditional pessimistic or read-you locking model down on MultiValue database servers. Okay. I think those are the main questions that have come in, Bob. If any more drift in afterwards, we'll answer them offline. Sometimes it takes a while for the questions to flow through.
Absolutely. There is another webinar on Thursday, much more in-depth, much more detail than we were able to cover in this introductory webinar. If there are no other questions at this time, we thank you very much for joining us, and as David says, if you do have any more questions, please submit them, and we'll be most happy to answer those questions for you. Also, if you would like an evaluation, please let us know, and we'll put you into the queue and get you started.
Great. Okay, Bob. So yeah, the hands-on Evoke webinar this Thursday will go into a lot more technical detail. We'll only do about 2 or 3 minutes overview at the start of that session, and then it'll be roll the sleeves up and use the product to do stuff. So if you'd like to get more flesh on the bone, as it were, in terms of technical detail, then the hands-on session is a great start for that.
We do have some more questions, David. We had another question about is the presentation being recorded, and the answer is yes. Hopefully, we do try to record it. Sometimes it doesn't work out as well as we wanted, but we will make them available too. Had a question about the data model is defined in the designer. Is this manually reproduced, or can this metadata be uploaded? Is there any validation of the model to the real source?
Okay, right. So that's a fair question. On the data model tab of the app generator is where you are able to point the app generator at a database, and it will hunt around for schema data, and it'll analyze what schema data it finds, and it will suggest entities that are to be created inside the app designer. So this is a kind of it's not exactly a one-off process, it's a one-direction process. So it's a direction of looking at your database content and trying to deduce the presence of entities. Now, at the moment, there isn't a reverse process, which is where you take the data model as you've created it inside the designer and use that as the basis for creating your database structure and schema and content. That's something that we have thought about doing, but we haven't done it yet because we're waiting to see what kind of interest from the customer base comes about in terms of that particular feature. So if you think that is something that you'd like the product to do, then please let us know, and we'll weight that development effort accordingly.
Good. And one more question about who are your development partners? If you go to the website, those partners are listed there, and we'd be most happy to put you in touch with those people too.
Great. Okay, Bob. I think that's it. So thanks everyone for attending. Hopefully you've you found that really interesting, and probably got lots of food for thought there. So please contact us if you have any more questions, and I will hopefully see lots of you at the hands-on session on Thursday.